Chapter 7. A man shouldn't have to have words sound through his head all day. Conrad kept telling himself not to dwell on Izzy's challenge from the day before. There were thousands of men in South Dakota, and out of all of them she had chosen him. Him. To read. Maybe a lot of them couldn't, but at the moment he sure felt like the only one with such a failing. After he had made it back to his home that evening and laid on his lonely bed, he had done little else but think about her words. "I wouldn't ask your brothers to read to me, but I'd ask you." Now, after a long day in the saddle, staying far away from his parents' house and Izzy Lawson, he was no closer to convincing his thoughts to leave off. He had also done something that he now regretted. Conrad pushed himself off his bed and slid his hand under his pillow, retrieving the book Izzy had read from. He had looked through the first few pages, but couldn't make hide nor hair out of the lines on the page. He knew his letters, but the sounds each one made had always been a mystery. The longer the word, the more his head just wouldn't work when faced with the problem of translating the symbols to sounds. Izzy hadn't given him the challenge, yet when he had taken the volume, he had tucked it into his vest on the way back to the house. Now he wanted to try. For her. That's why he had taken it. He had no books in his whole house. The way Izzy had held the book close to her meant she probably loved it, and she had probably already missed it. She would know he had taken it, so it was best to get the embarrassment over and return it to her, since he couldn't read it anyway. He shoved himself from his bed, donning his hat along the way, and strode out into the twilight. If she wasn't awake, he'd just leave the book in the sitting room, and she'd find it in the morning. If she was awake, he'd have to confess to taking it. If he didn't come up with a good reason, she might ask him if he enjoyed the poems. Then she'd want to know if he had found a favorite. That was what intelligent people did. They discussed poetry and talked a lot. He'd never been welcome in those circles and had never cared about the lack until just then, and it made him pert near sick thinking about it. Izzy was an intelligent woman, could have been a teacher, and he was just a rancher. Worse, a rancher who couldn't even read. He had no business even looking at her, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, much less stop his gaze from fixing on her whenever she was nearby, or picturing the soft curve of her lips, the taper of her neck, her narrow waist. He shook his head. His not thinking about her was leading him down trails that would get him into trouble. He stopped at the edge of the porch, bathed in the slight glow of the lamplight from the sitting room window. Inside, Izzy sat on the sofa with her head bent, concentrating on something. Her forehead was wrinkled slightly, and her eyes were narrowed. Though he wanted to give the book back to her, he also didn't want to disturb whatever she was doing. The door swung open, and Barton waved as he let the door shut behind him. "Evening, Conrad. Nice night for a walk. Thought I'd do the same." Barton never seemed to do anything without Lula, yet here he was, interrupting a perfect night. "Will your wife be joining you?" He stopped for a moment. "No, she's too tired. Too close to her time. I wasn't quite sure you could still breathe without her approval." Taunting Barton was just too much of a temptation. Something drove him, and he wanted Barton as grumpy as he was. "Not tonight, brother." Barton wouldn't rise to the barb. He glanced just behind his shoulder through the window. "Maybe chatting with a frustrated female will soothe the savage beast." He tipped his head and sauntered off into the night. Conrad couldn't keep his gaze from wandering to the window, and Izzy ducked her head quickly to escape being seen watching him. She had to have heard. Her cheeks went pink in the soft golden glow of the lamp. The glass was too thin to stop the noise of their conversation. She would have heard his baited comments. That drained all the fight out of him. His thoughtless words would make her think he was rude. No sense turning back now. She had seen him standing there and that he hadn't followed Barton. The distance to the door seemed a mile long as he trudged up the stairs and pulled the door wide. As he stepped inside, Izzy glanced up from her book as if she had just discovered he was there. He had to hold in a laugh. She was a terrible actress, and that pleased him. If she couldn't act, she couldn't lie. "Good evening, Conrad. I was sorry you didn't join us for supper tonight." The play of the light on her pale skin was a glorious sight, distracting him for a moment too long. He had thought about joining them, but his parents would have thought it strange, and so would Barton. They might wait until a private moment, but they would rib him about spending time with Mrs. Lawson. His ma wouldn't have it if she knew he had thought about her more than he ought. Izzy was a widow who should be in mourning, not out taking strolls with him. "Evening." He realized she was still waiting for his greeting. "I don't usually eat up here. Not really my place." She stood and clasped her tiny hands in front of her, her pretty, softly arched lips quivering slightly. "Barton and his wife were here. It was a pleasant meal. I hope you'll come once in a while." Why wasn't she asking about either of his other two brothers? Was it only him she wanted to see, or was he inspecting her words too closely? "I guess if Ma wants me to come, she'll extend an invitation." Izzy nodded and turned from him. "We spoke at supper about some excess flour sitting in the cellar. Moretta said that I might speak to you about using it." She glanced over her shoulder at him, pale as a sheet. Why would she be so nervous about talking to him? Unless his family had told her it was his fault they had so much flour. "Why ask me about it?" He took a deep breath to keep the edge from his voice. No sense in scaring her yet again. At least she was talking to him. "Moretta said you might have plans for it, and that I should speak to you. She just wasn't sure if it had a purpose, and didn't want me to make plans and then be disappointed." He didn't want her to be disappointed either. "What did you have in mind?" She turned back to him, and a fresh glow lit her face, which would have shocked him if he hadn't imagined just that look on her face all day long. "It's wonderful, really. Moretta said there's a storefront in town that used to be a boarding house. It has 2 large baking ovens in the back. I was thinking of staying in Belle Fourche and starting a bakery." She searched his face, her own open with excitement. Baking wasn't the first thing he thought of when he saw her. "Are you sure? That's what you want to do?" The happiness slipped off her like snow off a roof, and he could have kicked himself. He'd done it yet again. When would he learn to keep his mouth shut? "I guess it's a rather silly idea. Think nothing of it." Tension coiled in her words, hurt long buried. "I didn't say it was a silly idea. I just asked if you were sure. Taking on a new business is a big responsibility, and you just got here. You were so weak you couldn't even make it in the house. Not to mention, you wouldn't be out here much if you were working in town." And maybe that bothered him most of all. Didn't Lula want you out here with her? If he gave what should be her reason for staying, she may never suspect any other. She wouldn't raise her head. It stayed bent like a reed in the wind. "There's nothing for me out here, Conrad. I grew up on a ranch, but there's nothing I can do to help. I need to find some reason to get up in the morning. I'm not doing anyone any good. Lula needs a friend, but I don't want to stay underfoot. Your ma certainly doesn't need me around. She's the most ingenious woman I've ever met." He chuckled, despite Izzy's words. "That she is. But I still don't want to see you run off into town and start a business just because there are a few sacks of extra flour laying around. I'm sure there's plenty to do here, if you really wanted to put yourself to it. You haven't come near to wearing out your welcome yet." He handed her the book. the whole reason he had ventured from home, and he'd almost forgotten it. She stared first at the book, then up at him. "You had it? I thought I'd left it by the tree, and I was worried it had been ruined outside. But why? You said you don't like poetry." That was the most difficult question she could ask as she searched his eyes for the truth, before he could even speak. "I just wanted to look at it. I should have asked. I'm sorry for taking your book. I came back here tonight to return it." She picked the volume from his fingertips and set it on the table. "Oh, well, I guess since you've done what you came to do." She sat back down on the couch and laid her hands in her lap. Did she have to look so forlorn, so completely lonely, like him? And why did he feel the need to fix it? It shouldn't matter to him one bit if she were lonely. She was Lula's guest, not his. "I did have a question for you." He breathed deeply. Why wasn't this easy? "I have some trouble understanding poetry. Would you read it with me? Help me understand what he's talking about?" There. He hadn't admitted he couldn't do what most 7-year-olds could. Most men his age wouldn't know the first thing about poetry. Her face lit back up, the glow slamming into his chest and warming him from the inside out. She was gorgeous when she smiled. "Of course, I'd love to." She stood and grasped his hand with more strength than he'd given her credit for, and dragged him to the sofa, which he wouldn't have minded in the slightest if it had been for anything but reading. Before he could protest, she shoved him down into the seat and sat next to him, the scent of her hair breezing past his nose. "Perfect. We'll start with Wordsworth." Conrad bit his tongue. He'd gotten himself into a mess of hot water now.